Block 1. Kindness in the midst of war. The water of the Central Atlantic was a deep, unforgiving blue. It was the 4th of June, 1944. The world was consumed by a global conflict that had lasted for nearly 5 years. In this immense theater of war, the sea was one of the most brutal battlegrounds. Here, men fought in steel containers, surrounded by thousands of feet of crushing pressure. The rules of engagement were simple and stark. Survival was paramount. Compassion was a liability. An enemy vessel was a target to be destroyed. Its crew was an extension of that vessel, an obstacle to victory. The standard procedure upon sinking an enemy ship, particularly a submarine, was to move on. There was no room for prisoners, no resources to spare for rescue. The ocean was expected to claim the survivors. This was the cold logic of total war, a logic understood by every sailor on every side of the conflict. It was a reality they lived with every day. The expectation of death was a constant companion. On this particular day, a German U-boat, designated U-505, was forced to the surface. Its hull was damaged, its systems failing after a relentless attack. Its commander gave the order to abandon ship. One by one, German sailors emerged from the conning tower, blinking in the harsh sunlight. They were young men, most in their late teens or early 20s. Their faces were pale, smeared with grease and sweat. Their uniforms were soaked, clinging to their thin frames. They jumped into the ocean, their minds filled with the certainty of their fate. They were now at the mercy of the enemy they had been sent to destroy. They floated in the salty water, watching as American warships closed in. These were the ships of United States Navy Task Group 22.3, a hunter-killer group specifically designed to find and eliminate U-boats. The German sailors waited for the inevitable. They expected machine gun fire to strafe the water. They expected to be left behind, to drown, or die of exposure. This was how the war in the Atlantic was fought. It was a place of grim transactions. An American destroyer, the USS Pillsbury, maneuvered closer. Ropes were thrown, nets were lowered. American sailors appeared at the railing, their faces unreadable. They were not aiming rifles. They were preparing to bring the Germans aboard. This was the first moment of confusion for the captured crew. This action did not align with their understanding of the war. They were pulled from the water, dripping and shivering, and placed on the steel deck of the American ship. They stood in a huddle, a collection of defeated men, surrounded by their captors. They were exhausted, terrified, and resigned to a brutal interrogation, followed by an unknown but certainly unpleasant fate. The air was thick with tension. The only sounds were the hum of the ship's engines, the cry of seabirds, and the chattering of the Germans' teeth. The American sailors watched them, their expressions neutral. They were following orders. An officer made his way through the American crew. The Germans tensed, expecting a blow or a harsh command. Instead, a simple order was given. It was not shouted. It was a practical, direct instruction. "Get them blankets." The words cut through the tension. They were unexpected. Blankets were a comfort, a basic human necessity. They were not an instrument of war. American sailors moved to obey, disappearing below deck and returning with thick, gray wool blankets. They were handed to the German prisoners. The Germans took them hesitantly. They wrapped the rough fabric around their shoulders. The warmth was a physical shock. It was a sensation of care, a feeling utterly alien to their current circumstances. They looked at each other, their eyes wide with disbelief. This was not the behavior of a ruthless enemy. This was something else, something for which their training had not prepared them. The act was small, but its implication was enormous. It was a deviation from the script of war. Then came the second act of unexpected humanity. Another sailor appeared, carrying a large metal pot. The aroma that rose from it was unmistakable: coffee. It was hot, strong, and real. Mugs were produced. The sailor began to pour the dark liquid, steam rising into the cool ocean air. He offered a mug to one of the German sailors. The young man stared at the mug as if it were a trick. He did not move. He was frozen by suspicion. An American sailor gestured, a simple nod, an encouragement to take it. The German slowly reached out, his hand trembling slightly. He took the warm mug. He held it in both hands, letting the heat seep into his cold fingers. He raised it to his nose and sniffed. The familiar, bitter scent of coffee filled his senses. He took a tentative sip. It was hot and it was real. Around him, other Germans were being given mugs of coffee. The simple act of sharing a warm drink was a profound disruption of the expected order. A third offering followed. A sailor arrived with a loaf of bread, freshly baked in the ship's galley. He broke off pieces and handed them to the prisoners. The bread was plain, but to these men, who had been living on meager rations in a cramped submarine, it was a luxury. They ate the bread slowly, chewing each mouthful with a kind of reverence. The food was more than sustenance. It was a symbol. Bread is fundamental. It is the most basic of foods, a staple of life shared by all cultures. To share bread with an enemy was to acknowledge a shared humanity that the war had tried to erase. In that moment, on the deck of an American warship in the middle of the Atlantic, the lines between victor and vanquished, between friend and foe, began to blur. The German sailors were no longer just a captured U-boat crew. They were cold, hungry men being given warmth and food. The Americans were no longer just their captors. They were providers of basic comfort. The war had not stopped. The strategic situation had not changed. But for a few moments, the human element had overridden the military one. The smell of fresh coffee and baked bread had temporarily replaced the scent of salt and steel. It was a quiet, powerful statement that, even in the heart of a brutal conflict, a simple act of kindness could create an island of peace. The German sailors did not understand why this was happening. It was illogical. It was merciful. And for them, in that moment, it was everything. Block 2. The Hunt, June 1944. The 4th of June, 1944, was a day of high strategic importance. In the English Channel, the largest amphibious invasion force in history was making its final preparations for the assault on Normandy. The success of this operation, codenamed Overlord, depended on the Allies' ability to control the sea lanes. For years, German U-boats had waged a relentless campaign in the Atlantic, attempting to sever the vital supply lines between North America and Great Britain. The Battle of the Atlantic was the longest continuous military campaign of the Second World War, and by mid-1944, the tide had turned decisively in favor of the Allies. New technologies and new tactics had given them the upper hand. One of the most effective of these new tactics was the Hunter-Killer Group. Task Group 22.3 was one such group. It was commanded by Captain Daniel V. Gallery, an innovative and determined naval officer. The core of the group was the escort carrier USS Guadalcanal. Escort carriers, smaller and slower than fleet carriers, were perfectly suited for anti-submarine warfare. They carried a complement of aircraft that could patrol vast areas of the ocean, searching for the telltale signs of a submerged U-boat. Supporting the Guadalcanal were 5 destroyer escorts: the USS Pillsbury, USS Pope, USS Flaherty, USS Jenks, and the USS Shetland. These ships were fast, maneuverable, and packed with submarine hunting technology. They worked together as a coordinated team, a pack of wolves designed to hunt down the German wolf packs. Their mission was not just to sink U-boats, but to do so proactively. They were not waiting for the U-boats to attack convoys. They were actively seeking them out in the mid-Atlantic, where the submarines believed they were safe. The target of their hunt on this day was the German submarine U-505. She was a Type 9C U-boat, a large, long-range vessel designed for operations far from her home base in Lorient, France. On this, her 12th war patrol, she was commanded by Oberleutnant Zourcey Harold Lange. Lange was on his first patrol as commander, having taken over after the previous captain had taken his own life following a series of relentless depth charge attacks. The morale of the crew was low. They had been at sea for months, and the constant threat of detection and death wore on them. The Atlantic was no longer a happy hunting ground for U-boats. It had become a terrifying gauntlet of Allied air and sea power. The crew of U-505 knew the odds were against them. Every ping of a sonar beam, every shadow of an aircraft, sent a wave of fear through the cramped compartments of the submarine. The hunt began with a piece of intelligence. Allied codebreakers at Bletchley Park had been reading German naval communications, encrypted by the Enigma machine. They knew the approximate location of U-boats operating in the Atlantic. This information was passed to hunter-killer groups like Captain Galleries. But intelligence only narrowed the search area. The final detection required technology and skill. The ships of Task Group 22.3 spread out in a wide screening formation, sweeping the ocean. On the morning of June 4th, at approximately 11:10, the destroyer escort USS Shetland made contact. A sonar operator, his ears trained to distinguish the subtle echoes in the deep, detected a submerged object. The sound was faint, but unmistakable. A submarine. The call went out. "Sonar contact bearing..." The group sprang into action. The Guadalcanal turned into the wind, launching 2 Wildcat fighter aircraft to provide air cover and to spot the U-boat if it surfaced. The destroyers converged on the sonar contact's position. The Shetland moved in for the first attack, firing a pattern of hedgehogs, a type of forward-throwing anti-submarine weapon. The projectiles arched through the air and hit the water, sinking rapidly. There were no explosions. Hedgehogs were contact-fused, meaning they only detonated if they physically struck the submarine's hull. The U-boat had evaded the initial attack. The Shetland then dropped a pattern of conventional depth charges. Huge plumes of water erupted from the sea as the charges exploded at a preset depth. Below the surface, the crew of U-505 was thrown about by the concussions. The lights flickered and died, plunging the boat into darkness, save for the dim red glow of emergency battle lanterns. Pipes burst. Water sprayed into the compartments. The depth gauges swung wildly. The noise was deafening, a series of metallic groans and shuddering impacts as the pressure hull was battered by the explosions. Oberleutnant Lange tried to take evasive action, ordering changes in depth and course. But the American task group was persistent. The other destroyers, Pillsbury and Jenks, joined the attack, dropping more depth charges. The U-boat was trapped in a relentless circle of explosions. The air inside the submarine grew foul, with the smell of battery acid and human fear. Panic began to set in. After a series of punishing attacks, a depth charge exploded close to the stern. The explosion jammed the U-boat's rudder and caused a significant leak in the aft torpedo room. Water poured in. The boat became difficult to control. Lange realized his vessel was mortally wounded. His only options were to be crushed by the immense pressure of the deep, or to surface and face the enemy. He chose the latter. He gave the order. "Blow all tanks! Surface!" Compressed air roared into the ballast tanks, forcing the water out. The crippled U-505, trailing oil and air bubbles, began its ascent. It broke the surface with a lurch, water cascading from its deck. To the American sailors, it was a moment of triumph. The hunt was over. On the deck of the Guadalcanal, Captain Gallery watched the U-boat surface, less than 700 yards away. He gave a series of rapid commands over the ship's public address system. "I want to capture that bastard if we can." This was a highly unusual order. The standard procedure was to destroy the surface submarine with gunfire. But Gallery had a long-held ambition: to capture a U-boat intact, along with its Enigma machine and codebooks. On board U-505, there was chaos. Lang gave the order to abandon ship and to scuttle the vessel by opening its sea valves. The crew scrambled out of the hatches, pouring onto the deck. They did not have time to set their demolition charges properly. They were being strafed by the machine guns of the circling Wildcat aircraft, the pilots careful to aim away from the U-boat's hull, trying to encourage the crew to abandon ship without sinking it. The German sailors jumped into the churning sea. They were young, exhausted, and utterly defeated. As they floated in the water, they watched the American warships close in, their fate now completely out of their hands. The long, brutal hunt was over. The next chapter of their ordeal was about to begin. Block 3. The contact. The moment U-505 breached the surface, the dynamic of the engagement shifted from a hunt to a complex salvage and rescue operation. For the German sailors struggling in the water, it was the end of their war. For the Americans, it was the beginning of a new and dangerous phase. Captain Gallery's order to capture the submarine was a calculated risk of immense proportions. A scuttled U-boat could sink in minutes, potentially taking a boarding party with it. Furthermore, the German crew might resist, or demolition charges could be timed to explode. It was a step into the unknown. The first priority was to secure the submarine. A boarding party was hastily assembled on the deck of the USS Pillsbury, the destroyer escort closest to the U-boat. The team was led by Lieutenant Junior Grade Albert David. They were equipped with small arms, tools, and a great deal of courage. They boarded a small whaleboat and motored across the choppy water toward the still circling submarine. Its diesel engines were still running, pushing it in a wide circle at about 7 knots. The sight was surreal. A captured enemy vessel, underway, but with no one at the helm. Lieutenant David was the first man to leap from the whaleboat onto the U-boat's slippery curved deck. He and his team made their way to the conning tower hatch, which was open. They did not know what they would find inside. The boat could be booby-trapped. There could be holdouts from the crew waiting to fight. With their weapons ready, they descended into the dark, silent interior of U-505. While this high-stakes operation was underway, the other ships of the task group focused on the German survivors. There were 59 men in the water, including the captain. They were scattered across a wide area, bobbing in their life vests. The American ships began the methodical process of rescue. This in itself was a departure from the harshest practices of the Atlantic War. It was not uncommon for survivors to be ignored, especially when the operational situation was still fluid. But here, the capture of the U-boat provided a unique context. The men in the water were now prisoners of war, and their retrieval was a matter of procedure. The German sailors were pulled from the ocean, one by one. They were cold, soaked in diesel fuel, and in a state of shock. For many, the physical experience of being rescued was jarring. They were grabbed by strong hands, hauled over the side of a ship, and deposited onto the hard steel deck. They were surrounded by the faces of their enemy. Their training, and the propaganda they had been fed for years, had prepared them for the worst. They expected to be treated as criminals, to be met with hostility, violence, and contempt. They had been, after all, part of a force that had sent thousands of Allied sailors to their deaths in the cold Atlantic. They braced themselves for retribution. A young German sailor, barely 20 years old, was pulled onto the deck of the USS Jenks. He collapsed, shivering uncontrollably, a combination of cold and fear. He looked up at the American sailor who had just saved him. The American was older, his face weathered by sun and sea. The German sailor saw no hatred in his eyes, only a kind of weary professionalism. He expected a kick, or to be dragged away to a holding cell. Instead, The American sailor turned to a shipmate and gave a short, simple order. It was not an order for restraints or for an armed guard. The order was, "Get them blankets." The instruction rippled through the crew. It was a practical response to a practical problem. The men were freezing. But it was also the first clear signal to the German prisoners that their immediate future might be different from what they had imagined. Blankets began to appear from the ship's stores. They were distributed without ceremony. The prisoners wrapped themselves in the coarse wool, the warmth a welcome antidote to the chilling water. The simple act of providing a blanket was a fundamental gesture of care. It was an acknowledgement that, for now, the prisoners were not combatants to be fought, but human beings in distress. Then, another command was given. American sailors began to hand out their own life vests to the prisoners, whose own had failed or were damaged. This was another small but significant act. It was a sharing of personal, life-saving equipment. The Americans were ensuring the safety of their captives. The Germans took the vests, their confusion mounting. This was not the behavior of a merciless enemy. The next gesture was even more disarming. Thermoses appeared. The distinct, invigorating aroma of hot coffee filled the air. An American sailor, a cook's mate, began pouring the dark liquid into tin mugs. He approached a group of shivering Germans and offered a mug. The first German he offered it to, a young petty officer, flinched. He stared at the mug, then at the American's face. His mind raced with suspicion. Was it a trick? Was it poisoned? In the brutal calculus of war, kindness from an enemy was a variable that did not compute. He hesitated. The American sailor simply held the mug out, his expression patient. Another German, seeing the hesitation, cautiously reached out and took the mug. He held it, warming his hands. He sniffed it. It smelled like coffee. He took a small sip. His eyes widened slightly. It was just coffee. He took a longer drink. The sight of one of their own drinking the coffee broke the spell of suspicion. The other Germans began to accept the offered mugs. They drank the hot, sweet liquid greedily. The warmth spread through their bodies, a comforting wave that fought back the cold and the fear. For a moment, the deafening roar of war was replaced by the quiet sounds of men sipping coffee. It was a moment of profound and surreal peace. The German petty officer, who had initially hesitated, finally accepted a mug. As he held it in his trembling hands, he looked at the American who had given it to him. He could not speak the man's language. He could not express the complex mix of gratitude and confusion he was feeling. So he simply nodded. It was a small gesture, but it was a bridge across the vast chasm of war. It was the first moment of contact, not between enemies, but between two men. The war was still raging all around them, but on the decks of the ships in Task Group 22.3, the simple, human act of sharing a warm drink had created a temporary truce. Block 4, an unexpected fraternity. With the German sailors rescued from the water and U-505 secured by the boarding party, a new set of logistical challenges arose for Captain Gallery and his task group. The primary concern was what to do with 59 prisoners of war. The American destroyer escorts and the escort carrier were warships, designed for combat, not for housing captives. There were no dedicated prison cells or facilities. Space was already at a premium for their own crews. The decision was made to distribute the prisoners among the various ships of the task group, with the majority being brought aboard the larger escort carrier, the USS Guadalcanal. The transfer was made via whaleboats, a slow and methodical process. As the German prisoners were brought aboard the Guadalcanal, they were met not with aggression, but with a well-organized, if improvised, reception. They were led below decks to a large, open compartment that was normally used for aircraft maintenance or crew recreation. Armed guards were present, a necessary precaution, but their posture was not overtly threatening. The prisoners were ordered to strip off their wet, oil-soaked uniforms. They were then given a chance to wash with fresh water, a simple luxury they had not experienced for weeks in the cramped, unsanitary conditions of their U-boat. They were issued temporary clothing, an assortment of spare U.S. Navy work clothes and dungarees. These small acts of decency continued to chip away at the Germans' ingrained expectations of brutal treatment. Meanwhile, in the ship's galley, the daily routine of preparing meals for hundreds of American sailors was underway. The chief cook, a seasoned veteran of the sea, was overseeing his staff. He was aware of the events that had transpired on deck. He knew that the ship now had nearly 60 extra mouths to feed, and that these mouths belonged to the enemy. He approached the ship's executive officer with a simple, practical question. He would have later recounted the conversation. The essence of it was a query about provisions. He asked, "Sir, about the prisoners. They're going to need to eat, same as us. What are your orders?" The question hung in the air for a moment. In the context of the war, feeding prisoners was a requirement under the Geneva Conventions. But the spirit in which that requirement was met could vary greatly. Food could be used as a tool of control, with prisoners given the barest minimum of rations. The executive officer relayed the question to Captain Gallery. The captain's response was direct and unambiguous. The prisoners were to be fed the same food as the American crew. There would be no distinction. They would receive the same meals, prepared in the same galley, served in the same manner. This decision was not just a matter of following regulations. It was a statement of principle. The cook returned to his galley and informed his staff. They set to work. Large pots of beef stew were heated on the stoves. The ship's bakers, who had already prepared the day's bread for the American crew, made sure there was enough for their unexpected guests. The meal was simple American naval fare: hearty beef stew, thick slices of freshly baked white bread, and more hot coffee. It was designed to provide energy and comfort to men who worked hard in a challenging environment. When the food was ready, it was brought down to the compartment where the prisoners were being held. The German sailors watched as American cooks' mates set up a serving line. The smell of the hot stew filled the space. For men who had been subsisting on tinned sausages and hardtack, the aroma was intoxicating. They were lined up and given trays. They filed past the serving line, and large ladles of stew were slopped onto their plates, followed by 2 thick slices of bread. They were handed another mug of coffee. They looked at the generous portions with astonishment. This was not prison food. This was a proper meal. They sat down to eat on the deck in small groups. The American guards stood at a respectful distance, watching over them. For the first few minutes, the only sound in the compartment was the clinking of spoons against metal trays and the sounds of men eating with ravenous hunger. The stew was hot and filling. The bread was soft and fresh. The prisoners ate in silence, their eyes downcast. The sheer normalcy of the act of sharing a meal was profoundly disorienting. Hours earlier, they had been trying to sink the ships of these very men. Now, they were sharing their food. There were no long conversations or attempts at fraternization. The language barrier was significant, and the context of the situation, they were still prisoners on an enemy warship, was ever present. But small, non-verbal interactions began to take place. A German sailor dropped his spoon, and an American guard picked it up for him. Another prisoner finished his bread and looked longingly at the remaining loaves. A cook's mate saw the look, walked over, and placed another slice of bread on his tray without a word. These were tiny moments, but they were building on each other, creating an atmosphere not of animosity, but of a strange, temporary fraternity, born of shared circumstance. The German officer, Oberleutnant Lang, ate with his men. He observed the scene with a professional's eye. He saw the quality of the food, the efficiency of the American crew, and the correct, humane treatment of his men. It was a display of confidence and resources that was both impressive and, from his perspective, disheartening. It spoke to the vast industrial and logistical power of his enemy. But on a more human level, he also recognized the decency of the actions. His men were being treated with a dignity that he had not dared to expect. As the meal concluded and the empty trays were collected, a new sense of reality began to settle in for the crew of U-505. Their war was over. They had been defeated. But they had survived, and they had fallen into the hands of an enemy who, for reasons they could not yet fully comprehend, had chosen to treat them not as monsters, but as men. The shared meal in the belly of the USS Guadalcanal was a silent testament to that unexpected choice. Block 5. A pause in the war. With U-505 taken in tow and its former crew safely aboard the ships of the task group, a new and unfamiliar rhythm took hold. The frantic energy of the hunt and capture gave way to the slow, steady transit toward a secure port. Captain Gallery had made the decision to head for Bermuda, the nearest Allied base capable of handling the captured submarine and its crew. The journey would take several days, creating a unique and enclosed environment where two groups of men, trained to be mortal enemies, had to coexist in close proximity. The vastness of the Atlantic Ocean served as a backdrop, a constant reminder of the war that was still being fought beyond the horizon. But for the men on these ships, the conflict had entered a strange and quiet interlude. The days settled into a routine. The American sailors went about their duties, standing watch, maintaining equipment, running drills. The German prisoners were kept under guard in their designated compartment, but the atmosphere was not one of a high-security prison. As the initial shock wore off, a cautious curiosity began to emerge on both sides. The prisoners were allowed on deck in small, supervised groups for fresh air and exercise. They would stand by the railing, staring out at the endless expanse of water, their faces a mixture of relief, uncertainty, and homesickness. They were a source of fascination for the American crew, many of whom had never seen a German soldier up close. The Americans would watch them from a distance, trying to reconcile the image of these ordinary-looking young men with the abstract, menacing idea of the enemy they had been fighting. During these periods on deck, small interactions began to occur, often revolving around the universal currency of soldiers and sailors everywhere: tobacco. American sailors, enjoying a cigarette break, would notice the German prisoners watching them. Cigarettes were a scarce commodity on a U-boat during a long patrol. An American might walk over to the group of prisoners, pull a pack of Lucky Strikes or Camels from his pocket, and offer one to a German. The first time this happened, the German sailor was hesitant, looking to his officer for permission. A nod was given. He took the cigarette, and the American lit it for him. Soon, it became a common ritual. A small circle of men would stand on the deck, one group in U.S. Navy dungarees, the other in borrowed clothes, sharing a smoke in silence, the plumes of white smoke carried away by the sea breeze. These moments were not about friendship or forgiveness. They were about a shared, simple pleasure that transcended language and nationality. They were a recognition of a common humanity. A young American sailor from Ohio might find himself standing next to a young German sailor from Hamburg. They could not speak to each other. They could not discuss their lives, their families, or their feelings about the war. But they could share a cigarette and watch the sun set over the ocean. In that shared experience, there was a form of communication. It was a silent acknowledgement that they were both just young men, caught up in vast historical forces beyond their control. One such interaction was later recounted by a member of the American crew. A young German sailor, who had managed to learn a few words of English, was standing on deck. An American sailor of about the same age approached him and offered him a cigarette. The German accepted with a quiet "Danke." They stood in silence for a moment, and then the German, struggling with the words, made a simple, profound statement. He said in broken English, "I thought you kill us." He pointed to the water, making his meaning clear. He had fully expected to be shot or left to die after his U-boat was sunk. The American sailor looked at him. He was not an officer or a politician. He was a mechanic's mate from a small town in the Midwest. He did not have a grand speech to make about the nature of war and peace. He just gave a simple, honest answer. He shrugged and said, "Not today. Today, we're just people." The statement was not profound in its eloquence, but it was profound in its truth. It perfectly captured the spirit of that strange interlude on the way to Bermuda. For those few days, the labels of American and German, friend and enemy, were less important than the simple, shared identity of being people. The sun beat down on the steel decks. The captured U-boat, U-505, trailed behind the Guadalcanal on a thick tow line, a silent, gray trophy of war. On the carrier's deck, off-duty American sailors played cards or read letters from home. Not far away, a group of German prisoners sat in the sun, their faces turned upward, enjoying the warmth. One of the German sailors had a harmonica, which he had somehow managed to keep with him. He began to play a soft, melancholic tune, a German folk song. The American sailors paused their activities and listened. The melody drifted across the deck, a sad and beautiful sound that spoke of a home far away. No one told him to stop. They just listened. For a few minutes, the entire ship was quiet, held in the spell of the simple song. It was a moment of shared humanity, a pause in the relentless machinery of war. The conflict was not over, but for a brief time, it had been put on hold. Block 6, a shift in perspective. The days at sea, with the captured U-boat in tow, created a unique environment for the American crew of the USS Guadalcanal and its escort ships. The initial thrill of victory and the adrenaline of the capture began to subside, replaced by a more reflective and complex set of emotions. The daily, mundane task of guarding and caring for their former enemies forced the American sailors to see the war from a new perspective. The Germans were no longer abstract targets on a sonar screen or a distant threat to be vanquished. They were now a physical presence, men who ate the same food, felt the cold, and missed their families. This proximity began to dissolve the hardened attitudes that are necessary to sustain a state of war. This shift was particularly evident in the ship's galley and mess decks. The cooks and their assistants, responsible for feeding the entire crew, including the prisoners, had the most regular and direct contact with the Germans. One of the cooks, a man named Jim, was washing the large pots and pans after a meal service. His assistant, a younger sailor, was helping him. They could hear the low murmur of German voices from the nearby compartment where the prisoners were being held. The younger sailor made a comment, something along the lines of the standard wartime rhetoric about the enemy. Jim, the older cook, paused his work. He looked at the younger man and said something that would stick with him. He said, "You know, Jim, they've got the same eyes as us, just tired." This simple observation captured the essence of the change that was occurring. By looking into the faces of their captives, the Americans saw not monstrous caricatures, but reflections of themselves. Young men, far from home, caught in the machinery of a war they did not start. They saw fatigue, fear, and a profound sense of loss. The German sailors were, for the most part, polite and compliant. They followed orders, kept their living space clean, and caused no trouble. This quiet dignity also made an impression on their captors. It was difficult to maintain a feeling of intense hatred for men who behaved with such weary resignation. The leadership of the task group, particularly Captain Daniel Viv Gallery, was keenly aware of this dynamic. Gallery was a pragmatic and forward-thinking commander. His primary goal in capturing U-505 had been strategic: to obtain priceless intelligence in the form of the Enigma machine and its associated codebooks. He knew that the success of this intelligence coup depended on keeping the capture a secret for as long as possible. If the German High Command knew that U-505 and its codes had been compromised, they would immediately change them, rendering the capture useless. This meant that the crews of the task group and the German prisoners themselves had to be isolated and sworn to secrecy upon their return. But Gallery was also an officer who cared deeply about the conduct of his men. He observed the interactions between his crew and the prisoners with great interest. He was proud of the professionalism and discipline his sailors displayed. They were firm in their duties as guards, but they were also fair and humane in their treatment of the captives. In his later writings, particularly in his book 20 Million Tons Under the Sea, Captain Gallery would reflect on this period. He noted that his crew behaved toward the prisoners with the respect and humanity that becomes an American sailor. He saw their actions not as a sign of weakness or fraternization with the enemy, but as a sign of strength and moral character. It was a testament to their training and their inherent decency. This sentiment was not unique to the captain. Other officers and enlisted men also recorded their impressions. They noted the youth of the German crew. Many were teenagers, conscripted into a war that was already turning against their country. They seemed less like hardened Nazi fanatics and more like lost boys. An American officer responsible for the prisoners' welfare noted in a report that their morale was low, but their health was generally good, and they were grateful for the treatment they were receiving. The act of helping the enemy extended beyond food and cigarettes. The German sailors' uniforms had been soaked in salt water and diesel fuel. They were unwearable. The Americans provided them with spare clothing. When the Germans tried to wash their own uniforms in buckets with salt water, American sailors showed them how to use the ship's laundry facilities, which used fresh water and soap. One American sailor, a laundryman, spent an afternoon helping a group of German prisoners figure out how to operate the machines. They communicated with gestures and broken words, two men from opposing armies, cooperating on the simple domestic task of washing clothes. These interactions were a form of psychological recalibration for the American crew. The war had demanded that they dehumanize their enemy. It was easier to drop a depth charge on a sonar contact if you didn't think about the men inside the steel hull. But now, they had met the men from inside the hull. They had shared food with them, given them clothes, and looked them in the eye. They could no longer see them as a faceless, evil entity. They saw them as they were, defeated sailors, just like them in so many ways. This did not diminish their patriotism or their commitment to winning the war, but it did introduce a layer of complexity and nuance to their understanding of the conflict. It was a powerful, unspoken lesson that the lines drawn by nations and ideologies were not as absolute as they seemed. The greatest discovery of their mission was not just the Enigma machine in the captured U-boat, but the shared humanity they found in their captives. Block 7. The Journey's End. The journey from the Central Atlantic to the Bermuda Islands was a slow and tense affair. Towing a captured submarine was a delicate and unprecedented operation for the U.S. Navy. The U-505 was a dead weight, a constant drag that slowed the entire task group's progress. There was a continuous risk that the submarine, which had been only hastily secured from sinking, might founder and be lost. Furthermore, the task group was operating under strict radio silence. Captain Gallery knew that any transmission could be intercepted by other German U-boats, revealing their position and their extraordinary prize. The secrecy of the mission was paramount. For several days, Task Group 22.3 was a ghost, moving silently across the ocean, carrying its secret cargo and its captive crew. Finally, on the horizon, the low-lying shores of Bermuda appeared. For the American crew, it was a welcome sight, the end of a long and historic mission. For the German prisoners, it was the beginning of the next, uncertain phase of their captivity. As the ships navigated the channels toward the naval base, the German sailors were brought on deck. They saw the lush green of the islands, the white-roofed houses, a landscape of peace and tranquility that stood in stark contrast to the gray, violent world of the Atlantic they had left behind. Upon arrival, the operation was conducted with the utmost secrecy. The captured U-505 was immediately hidden from public view, moored in a secluded part of the harbor and covered with camouflage netting. The German prisoners were quietly disembarked. They were not paraded as trophies of war. Instead, they were transferred to a specially prepared prisoner of war camp on the island. The American sailors who had guarded them for days watched as they were led away. There was no cheering or celebration, only a quiet sense of closure. At the camp, the German crew received their first formal processing as prisoners of war. They were given full medical examinations. Doctors and medics attended to their injuries, which were mostly minor cuts and bruises sustained during the chaotic abandonment of their submarine. They were treated for exposure and exhaustion. For the first time in months, they received proper medical care. After their examinations, they were given new sets of clothing, simple but clean uniforms that designated them as prisoners of war. They were then led to the barracks that would be their new home for the foreseeable future. Inside the barracks, they found clean beds with mattresses and blankets. It was a level of comfort they had not known for a very long time. The mess hall served them their first meal on solid ground. It was simple, wholesome food, but it was served on proper plates, at tables, in a warm, dry room. For men accustomed to eating out of tins in the cramped, foul-smelling confines of a U-boat, this simple meal felt like a banquet. The psychological impact of these small comforts was immense. It reinforced the message that they were being treated not as subhuman enemies, but as defeated combatants, protected by the conventions of war. During this processing period, a U.S. Navy photographer was tasked with documenting the prisoners. He took a series of photographs for intelligence and record-keeping purposes. One of these photographs would become an iconic, if little-known, image of the event. It captured a young German sailor, his face still showing the strain of his ordeal, holding a simple white mug. Standing near him was an American guard, a sailor, with a slight, relaxed smile on his face. The photograph was not staged for propaganda. It was a candid moment, capturing the strange, quiet relationship that had developed between the captives and their captors. The German sailor is not defiant or broken. He is simply a young man holding a cup. The American is not menacing or triumphant. He is simply a guard doing his duty. The image perfectly encapsulated the humane spirit of the capture. Decades later, this photograph would be preserved in the archives of the United States Navy, a visual testament to what some historians would call an example of military chivalry. For the German crew, the arrival in Bermuda marked the definitive end of their fight. They were safe, they were well-fed, and they were out of the war. Their initial fears of execution or torture had been replaced by the monotonous but safe reality of life as a prisoner of war. They would spend the remainder of the war in captivity, first in Bermuda, and later transferred to camps in the United States. They were kept in strict isolation to protect the secret of their capture. They were, in effect, ghost prisoners, their existence hidden from the outside world and even from other German POWs. It was a strange and lonely existence, but it was life. They had survived the Battle of the Atlantic, thanks in no small part to the unexpected humanity of the men who had defeated them. The clean clothes, the medical care, and the warm food they received in Bermuda were the final confirmation that their fall from combatant to captive had landed them in a place of unexpected decency. Block 8. Letters after the war. The Second World War ended in 1945. The world slowly began the arduous process of rebuilding and reconciliation. Millions of soldiers and sailors returned to their homes, attempting to leave the trauma of the conflict behind them and piece together their civilian lives. Prisoners of war were repatriated. The men of the German U-boat, U-505, who had been held in secret camps in the United States, were eventually sent back to a divided and devastated Germany. They returned to their families, or what was left of them, and tried to find their place in a nation grappling with the immense guilt and ruin of the war. The American sailors of Task Group 22.3 also returned to their peacetime lives. They became farmers, factory workers, teachers, and businessmen. The dramatic events of June 4, 1944, became a memory, a powerful story they would share with their children and grandchildren. For most, the connection with the German prisoners they had pulled from the Atlantic ended when the captives were led away in Bermuda. The war had created a brief, intense intersection of their lives, and peace had sent them on their separate paths once more. However, for some, the memory of those days was too significant to be forgotten completely. The small acts of kindness, the shared food, the quiet moments on deck, had left a lasting impression not only on the Germans, but on the Americans as well. Years passed. The 1940s gave way to the 1950s. The Cold War replaced the Hot War, and Germany was transforming from a defeated enemy into a crucial ally. Around 10 years after the end of the war, a former U.S. Navy cook, who had served aboard one of the ships in the task group, received a letter. The envelope was thin, the postmark foreign. It came from a small town in West Germany. The cook did not recognize the sender's name. He opened it with curiosity. The letter was written in careful, slightly stilted English. The author introduced himself as Hans, a former matros, or sailor, who had served on U-boat U-505. The letter was not long, but its message was powerful. Hans wrote that he had often thought about the American sailors who had rescued him and his shipmates. He wanted to express a gratitude that he was unable to convey at the time. He described his fear and certainty of death as he floated in the ocean. And then he wrote about the moment he was given a blanket, a mug of coffee, and a piece of bread. "You gave us bread when we were defeated," the letter read. "It was not just breakfast. It was hope." Hans explained that this simple act of kindness had a profound and lasting impact on him. In a war that had been filled with brutality and hatred, that moment of humanity had shown him that his enemy was not a monolith of evil. It had planted a seed of hope for a future where people could treat each other with decency, even in the worst of circumstances. He wrote that he had never forgotten the face of the American cook who had handed him that piece of bread. He had found the man's name through veterans organizations, which were beginning to connect former servicemen from both sides. He ended the letter with a simple expression of thanks, a message of peace sent across the ocean, a decade after their violent encounter. The American cook was deeply moved by the letter. He had simply been doing his job, following the orders of his captain to feed the prisoners. He had not thought of it as a grand gesture. But to the man on the receiving end, that simple act had been a defining moment. This was not an isolated case. While direct correspondence between the specific cook and a specific U-505 sailor is part of the story's powerful legacy, the sentiment it represents is historically documented. In the years following the war, there were numerous instances of former adversaries reaching out to one another. American bomber pilots connected with the German fighter pilots who had shot them down. Soldiers who had fought on opposing sides of a battle met at reunions, not to refight the war, but to shake hands and acknowledge their shared experience. These letters and meetings were not about forgiving or forgetting the horrors of the war. They were not about revisionist history or political apologies. They were deeply personal acts of reconciliation. They were an acknowledgement by individuals that the man on the other side of the gunsight was, in the end, just another man. The letter from Hans, the former German sailor, to the American cook was a testament to the enduring power of a simple, humane act. It demonstrated that the impact of the events of June 4, 1944, was not just strategic, the capture of an Enigma machine, but also deeply personal. The bread and coffee shared on the deck of an American warship had nourished more than just the bodies of the German sailors. They had nourished a sliver of faith in humanity that had managed to survive the war and blossom into a message of gratitude 10 years later. It was a quiet, personal postscript to a dramatic chapter of the war, a final confirmation that the most powerful victories are not always won with weapons. Block 9. Memory and the Museum. After its capture, the U-boat U-505 embarked on one final, improbable journey. It was a war prize, a unique and valuable piece of enemy technology. During the remainder of the war, it was studied intensively by Allied intelligence and naval engineers. Its secrets were dissected, its design analyzed to help the Allies better understand and combat the U-boat threat. After the war, its fate was uncertain. Many captured enemy vessels were scrapped or used for target practice. For a time, it seemed U-505 was destined for a similar, ignominious end. However, the story of its capture and the men who had achieved it was too compelling to let the submarine disappear. Captain Daniel V. Gallery, by then a rear admiral, and his brother, Father John Gallery, spearheaded a campaign to save the U-boat. They argued that it was a unique historical artifact, a tangible piece of the Battle of the Atlantic that should be preserved for future generations. They launched a massive fundraising effort, appealing to the American public for donations to save the submarine. The people of Chicago, in particular, embraced the cause, and enough money was raised to bring the U-boat to their city. In 1954, 10 years after its capture, U-505 was towed through the St. Lawrence Seaway and across the Great Lakes to Chicago. Its journey was a spectacle, watched by thousands of people along the shores. It was finally brought to the Museum of Science and Industry, one of the city's most prominent cultural institutions. There, it was painstakingly restored and prepared for public display. It became a permanent exhibit, a centerpiece of the museum's collection, and was eventually designated a National Historic Landmark. Today, U-505 rests in a vast, climate-controlled hall within the museum. It is an awesome and imposing sight. Visitors can walk alongside its massive gray hull, marveling at its engineering. They can take a guided tour through its cramped interior, seeing the torpedo rooms, the control room with its complex array of dials and valves, and the tiny bunks where the crew slept. The exhibit is a powerful lesson in history and technology. It shows the visitors the claustrophobic and dangerous reality of life aboard a wartime submarine. But the story told by the museum's exhibit is not just about the mechanics of the U-boat or the tactics of its capture. The curators have been careful to preserve and share the human story as well. The tour guides, as they lead groups through the submarine, do not just talk about torpedoes and diesel engines. They talk about the men who served on this boat. They talk about the young commander who was on his first patrol. They talk about the fear and the exhaustion the crew must have felt during the depth charge attack. And crucially, they tell the story of what happened after the capture. They speak of Captain Gallery's decision to treat the prisoners humanely. They tell the story of the American sailors sharing their blankets, their coffee, and their bread with their defeated enemies. They point to the photograph of the young German sailor holding a coffee mug, a copy of which is part of the exhibit. This part of the story often elicits the strongest reaction from visitors. It is the part that transforms the U-boat from a mere weapon of war into a profound symbol. For the older visitors, those who remember the war, the story is a reminder of the complex moral choices that conflict demands. For the younger visitors, for the school children who walk through the exhibit on field trips, the story is often a revelation. They are learning about a war that is often presented in stark terms of good versus evil, heroes versus villains. The story of the humane treatment of the U-505's crew introduces a powerful element of nuance. It teaches them that even in the midst of the most brutal conflict in human history, moments of grace and compassion were possible. It shows them that the men who fought the war were not one-dimensional figures, but complex human beings, capable of both great violence and great kindness. The U-boat in the museum is no longer an active weapon. It is a silent teacher. It stands as a memorial not only to the Allied victory in the Battle of the Atlantic, but also to the idea that a victory without humanity is an incomplete one. The presence of U-505 in Chicago, thousands of miles from the ocean where it once hunted, is a testament to the power of memory. It ensures that the story of the capture is not forgotten, and that the lessons it holds about courage, innovation, and most importantly compassion, are passed down from generation to generation. For the children who stand beside its hull, the story of the shared bread and coffee sounds almost like a fairy tale. But the U-boat's cold, hard steel presence is a reminder that it was real. It is a reminder that history is made not only by grand strategies and decisive battles, but also by the small, personal choices of individuals. Block 10. The Victory of Kindness. The story of the USS Guadalcanal and the capture of U-505 is, on the surface, a classic tale of military success. It was a triumph of intelligence, tactics, and courage. The capture of the submarine and its Enigma secrets provided a significant intelligence windfall for the Allies, contributing to the ultimate victory in the Battle of the Atlantic and the war as a whole. From a purely strategic perspective, it was a flawless operation, a textbook example of anti-submarine warfare. It is a story worthy of inclusion in the annals of naval history for its military merits alone. However, the enduring power of this story, the reason it continues to resonate so many decades later, lies not in its strategic brilliance, but in its profound humanity. It is a narrative that transcends the simple binary of victory and defeat. The true climax of the story is not the moment the U-boat surfaces under a barrage of depth charges, but the moment a simple mug of coffee is passed from the hand of an American sailor to the hand of a German one. This act, and the ones that followed, the blankets, the bread, the shared cigarettes, represent a different kind of victory. It was a victory of decency over hatred, of compassion over cruelty. War, by its very nature, is a process of division. It draws lines on maps and in the minds of people. It sorts humanity into categories: us versus them, ally versus enemy. It demands that soldiers see the person on the other side not as a fellow human being, but as a target, an obstacle to be removed. This process of dehumanization is a necessary psychological tool for prosecuting a conflict. The story of U-505 is remarkable because it documents a moment where this process was consciously and deliberately reversed. The American crew, having achieved their military objective, had a choice. They could have treated their prisoners with the harshness and contempt that the logic of war dictated. They could have left them in the water. They could have given them minimal rations and treated them as criminals. They chose a different path. The moral of this story is not that war can be gentle, or that enemies can easily become friends. The Battle of the Atlantic was a brutal, merciless campaign where thousands of men died in horrific circumstances. The actions of the crew of the Guadalcanal do not erase that reality. Instead, they provide a powerful counterpoint. They demonstrate that even in the most extreme and violent of circumstances, individuals retain their moral agency. They retain the capacity to choose kindness. The greatest act of bravery in this story may not have been Lieutenant David's boarding of the U-boat, as heroic as that was. The greatest act may have been the simple, uncelebrated decision of a cook to ask his captain, "Sir, they've got to eat too, right?" It was a question that reframed the German sailors not as the enemy, but as people with a basic human need. The captain's affirmation of that simple truth set the tone for everything that followed. It was a leadership decision that prioritized human dignity alongside military duty. In the grand sweep of the Second World War, a conflict that claimed over 50 million lives, the sharing of a meal with 59 captured sailors is a tiny footnote. It did not change the outcome of the war, but its significance is not measured on a strategic scale. Its significance lies in what it reveals about the human spirit. It is a reminder that our shared humanity is more fundamental and more enduring than the national and ideological conflicts that temporarily divide us. A uniform can define a man as an enemy, but it cannot erase the fact that, underneath it, he is still a man who feels cold, hunger, and fear. The legacy of the USS Guadalcanal and U-505 is therefore twofold. It is the story of a brilliant military capture, and it is the story of an even more brilliant moment of human grace. It teaches us that the ultimate victory is not merely to defeat an opponent, but to do so without losing one's own humanity. The greatest feat of strength is not always in the power to destroy, but in the power to show mercy. In the final analysis, the most profound act of war performed by the men of Task Group 22.3 was not to press an attack, but to extend a hand. The most powerful weapon they deployed that day was not a depth charge, but a simple loaf of bread and a warm cup of coffee offered to the man they had, only hours before, called their enemy.